Hi, my name is Mohammad Husnain Akbar. Today I am going to talk about the key themes that impact the government policy making to better the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is the table of contents. Colonization legacy influences indigenous policy. The historical dispossession of land and resources has led to profound socio-economic disparities among indigenous communities. This legacy, coupled with forced assimilation and intergenerational trauma, continues to influence policies today. For instance, land rights struggles persist affecting indigenous access to traditional lands and resources. This has resulted in ongoing debates and legal battles over native title and land rights, highlighting the enduring impact of colonialism on indigenous peoples' relationship with the land and their ability to exercise self-determination. Expanding on this, it is crucial to recognize that ramifications of colonization extend far beyond mere land laws. The socio-economic disparities rooted in the history permeate every aspect of indigenous life, from health outcomes to educational attainment. Generations of indigenous Australians have endured systematic marginalization, with economic, social, and political systems often working against their interests. Recognition and normalization aim for progress. Efforts to address past injustice and build positive relationships are essential. However, achieving recognition requires more than symbolic gestures. It necessitates concerted actions such as supporting indigenous languages, preserve cultural heritage, and ensuring equitable access to resources and opportunities. For example, the national apology to the stolen generations in 2008 was a significant step forward in acknowledging past wrongs. But meaningful recognition requires ongoing commitment to addressing the ongoing impacts of historical injustice, such as intergenerational trauma and socio-economic disadvantage. This aspect highlights the need for sustained efforts in recognition beyond symbolic gestures. Concerted actions such as supporting indigenous languages and preserving cultural heritage not only acknowledge the past but actively work towards healing and empowerment. Furthermore, equitable access to resources and opportunities is vital in addressing systematic inequalities that continue to impact indigenous communities. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander demise impact indigenous governance. The dismantling of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission in 2005 has left a governance gap in Indigenous affairs. While there are ongoing advocacy efforts for Indigenous rights and recognition, the absence of a dedicated Indigenous representative body has impacted policy development and implementation. This gap underscores the need for meaningful Indigenous representation in decision-making progress. Recent calls for a new representative body, such as the proposed National Indigenous Voice to Parliament, highlight ongoing efforts to address the governance deficit and ensure that indigenous voices are heard at the highest levels of government. The demise of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander has had far-reaching consequences for indigenous governance and representation. The absence of a dedicated body has left indigenous communities without a unified voice in policy-making process, resulting in decisions that may not fully consider their perspectives and needs. Moving forward, the establishment of a new representative body coupled help address this gap and facilitate more inclusive and effective policy development. Struggles for autonomy and equality persist. Despite progress, indigenous communities continue to face systematic barriers to autonomy and equality. These barriers include discriminatory practices in healthcare, education, and employment, Achieving equality requires targeted policies that address these disparities and empower indigenous communities to control their own destinies. For example, initiatives such as the Indigenous Procurement Policy aim to increase indigenous participation in the economy and create opportunities for economic self-determination. However, structural barriers such as racism and institutionalized discrimination continue to hinder progress, highlighting the need for comprehensive policy responses that address the root causes of inequality. The struggle for autonomy and equality remains a central challenge in indigenous policy. Discriminatory practices, whether overt or systematic, continue to impact indigenous advancement in various sectors. Meaningful progress requires not only targeted policies but also a concerted effort to address the underlying structural inequalities that perpetuate disparities. Government interventions must impact indigenous communities. Top-down government interventions such as the Northern Territory intervention have often failed to address the root causes of social issues with indigenous communities. These interventions often overlook community perspectives and needs, leading to a breakdown in trust between indigenous peoples and the government. For instance, the Northern Territory intervention was criticized for its punitive approach and lack of consultation with affected communities, leading to increased stigma and marginalization. Moving forward, there is a need for more collaborative and community-led approaches to policy development that prioritize indigenous voices and perspectives. Government interventions in indigenous affairs have historically been fraught with controversy and criticism. Many of these interventions, while well-intentioned, have failed to adequately engage with indigenous communities or address the underlying causes of social issues. Moving towards more collaborative and community-led approaches is essential in building trust and ensuring that policies are responsive to the needs and aspirations of indigenous peoples. Balancing assimilation and protection remains challenging. There is a delicate between assimilation policies and efforts to preserve indigenous cultures. Policies must respect indigenous autonomy and support cultural revitalization initiatives while also promoting social integrations. For example, programs such as the Indigenous Language and Arts Program aim to support the preservation and revitalization of indigenous languages and cultural practices. However, efforts to promote cultural pride and resilience must be accompanied by initiatives that address the root causes of cultural erosion, such as socioeconomic disadvantage and discrimination. This aspect highlights the complexity of indigenous policymaking, where policymakers must navigate between preserving cultural heritage and promoting social integration. Efforts to support cultural revitalization must go hand in hand with addressing systematic inequalities that threaten the very existence of indigenous cultures. Indigenous voices must guide policy decisions. Meaningful consultation with indigenous communities is crucial for developing effectiveness policies. Indigenous knowledge, values, and perspectives should be central to policy making process to ensure that solutions are culturally sensitive and addressing the unique needs of indigenous peoples. For example, the Uluru Statement from the Hut called for a constitutionally enhanced voice to Parliament, which would ensure that indigenous Australians have a say in decisions that affect their lives. This call reflects a growing recognition of the importance of indigenous-led governance and decision-making in achieving positive outcomes for indigenous communities. The call for indigenous-led policy decision underscores the importance of recognizing and valuing indigenous knowledge and perspectives. Meaningful consultation and engagement with indigenous communities not only ensure the cultural appropriateness of policies but also foster a sense of ownership and empowerment among indigenous peoples. Closing the Gap initiatives seek equity. While there have been initiatives aimed at closing the gap in health, education, and employment outcomes, progress has been slow. Achieving equality requires sustained investment in targeted programs and services as well as meaningful engagement with indigenous stakeholders to drive systematic change. For example, the Close the Gap campaign has called for a comprehensive long-term approach to addressing indigenous disadvantage, including the development of culturally appropriate health services and the implementation of strategies to address social and economic inequality. However, progress has been hampered by inconsistent funding, a lack of coordination between governments, and a failure to prioritize indigenous voices and perspectives in policy development and implementation. The ongoing challenge of closing the gap highlights the need for sustained commitment and investment in addressing indigenous disadvantage. Meaningful progress requires not only targeted intervention but also a holistic and coordinated approach that addressing the underlying structural determinants of health, education, and employment outcomes. Indigenous policy landscape reflect power dynamics. Historical power imbalances continue to shape indigenous policy landscapes. Decolonizing approaches are needed to shift power dynamics and ensure that indigenous communities are empowered to participate fully in decision-making processes that affect their lives. For example, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody highlighted the need for structural changes to address systematic racism and discrimination within the justice system. However, efforts to address these issues have been hampered by resistance from entrenched interests and a lack of political will to implement meaningful reforms. Addressing power imbalance in indigenous policy-making requires a fundamental shift towards decolonizing approaches that prioritize indigenous self-determination and empowerment. This involves not only addressing systematic injustice but also challenging entrenched power structures that perpetuate inequality and marginalization. Addressing systematic issues is key for change. Systematic barriers perpetuate inequality and hinder indigenous advancement. Policies must address these root causes by tackling issues such as institutional racism, unequal access to resources, and socio-economic disparities. Structural reforms are necessary to create a more equitable society for all Australians. For instance, the Indigenous Advancement Strategy was introduced in 2014 to streamline Indigenous funding and improve outcomes in key priority areas such as education, employment, health. However, the strategy has been criticized for its top-down approach and lack of meaningful engagement with indigenous communities, highlighting the need for more inclusive and community-led approaches to policy development and implementation. Structural reforms aimed at addressing systematic issues are essential in creating a more equitable society for all Australians. These reforms must address not only the symptoms but also the root causes of inequality, challenging enhanced power structures, and ensuring that policies are responsive to the needs and aspirations of Indigenous communities. Learning from past mistakes informs policy improvements. Reflection on past policies and their impact is essential for incoming future approaches. Acknowledging failures and injustice can lead to more effective policies that are responsive to the needs of indigenous communities. Continuous learning and adaptation are crucial for achieving meaningful change. For example, the Bringing Them Home report which documented the experience of the stolen generations, played a crucial role in raising awareness of past injustice and advocating for reparations and recognition. However, efforts to address the ongoing legacy of the stolen generations have been hampered by political resistance and a lack of coordinated action at the national level. Learning from past mistakes is essential in forming future approaches to indigenous policymaking. By acknowledging failures and injustice, policymakers can develop more effective and culturally sensitive policies that address the root causes of inequality and marginalization. Empowering indigenous communities drives effective policies. Supporting community-led initiatives and respecting indigenous self-determination are key principles for effective policymaking. Investing in indigenous leadership, capacity building, and resources allocation is essential for fostering sustainable development and empowering indigenous communities to shape their own futures. For example, the Indigenous Ranger Program has been successful in empowering indigenous communities to manage and protect their traditional lands while also providing employment and training opportunities. However, the program has been hampered by inconsistent funding and a lack of recognition of the value of indigenous and management practices, highlighting the needs for greater investment and support for indigenous initiatives. Empowering indigenous communities is essential in ensuring that policies are responsive to their needs and aspirations. Supporting community-led initiatives not only fosters sustainable development but also strengthens indigenous self-determination and resilience. In conclusion, addressing the challenge faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people requires targeted policies that acknowledge historical injustice, empower indigenous communities, and promote equality and justice. By centering indigenous voices, respecting cultural diversity, and fostering collaboration, we can work towards a more inclusive and equitable society for all Australians. Thank you.